It was early 1944. Winter still clung to the airfields of Ohio. At Wright Field, Dayton, the world's most advanced fighter waited in silence beneath the gray American sky. Ground crews stood in heavy coats, their breath turning to mist as a Merlin engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life with a sound that seemed to shake the horizon. The aircraft was the North American P-51 Mustang, already a legend in the making. But today something was different, something unseen, hidden not in its wings or design but in the fuel that filled its tanks. Inside that liquid shimmered the future of aerial warfare, 150-grade aviation fuel, an experimental blend unlike anything that had ever powered flight. As the test pilot, Lieutenant Henry Johnson taxied the fighter onto the runway, engineers and officers watched from the sidelines. They were not expecting a new aircraft to emerge that day. They were expecting a new kind of power. The takeoff roll began. The Mustang's wheels clawed the earth as the Merlin engine screamed through its range, fed by the high-octane fuel that burned hotter, cleaner and stronger than anything before it. At 25,000 feet, the throttle pushed past its usual limits. Boost pressure climbed, 70 then 75 inches of mercury, a figure that would have torn a normal engine apart, but the Merlin didn't falter. It sang. The airspeed needle surged past every known record for the type, 448 miles per hour, sustained, stable, relentless. Observers below stared at their instruments in disbelief. In that moment, the Mustang was no longer just another fighter. It was a chemical miracle, a machine reborn through science. This was not the creation of new metal or design genius. This was alchemy through chemistry. Until that day, the American Mustang had already been formidable, its range unmatched, its maneuverability deadly. But against the best of the German Luftwaffe, the Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, the margin of superiority had been narrow. Combat was still decided by pilot skill and circumstance. Now, with the arrival of Grade 150 fuel, that fragile balance tilted violently in favor of the Allies. The new blend allowed higher manifold pressures, richer fuel mixtures, and thus far greater horsepower without detonation, the catastrophic knock that destroyed engines at high stress. In engineering terms, it was a triumph of chemistry. In strategic terms, it was a weapon of supremacy. To the men at Wright Field, it was clear this was more than an upgrade. It was a transformation. Back in Europe, the Allied air campaign faced its greatest challenge. American bomber streams were suffering horrific losses. The Luftwaffe's interceptors, fast, agile, deadly, had turned daylight raids into slaughter. What the Allies needed was not just courage, but a technological edge powerful enough to rewrite the rules of the air war. And that edge had just been born on an American runway. From this test forward, aviation fuel would cease to be a passive component of flight. It would become an active instrument of victory, the silent force inside the engine, the unseen power that determined who lived and who fell, flaming from the sky. The test ended with a perfect landing. The pilot climbed out, grinning, his flight suit soaked with sweat. "It feels like flying lightning," he said, words that would echo through Allied command rooms as data poured in confirming the results. That very evening, telegrams were sent across the Atlantic to British Air Ministry liaisons. Tests successful. 150-grade fuel exceeds expectations. Mustang exceeds 440 mph at altitude. Recommend operational trials. The war for air supremacy was no longer about airframes and guns. It had entered a new dimension, the realm of fuel, chemistry, and combustion. The Germans had their aces, their tactics, and their steel. But what they did not have, what they could not imagine, was this new breed of energy, this invisible catalyst that would soon turn the P-51 into a demon over Europe. In the silent hangars of Wright Field, the revolution had begun. And with it, the first spark of victory that would ignite the skies above a burning continent. It was early 1944. Winter still clung to the airfields of Ohio. At Wright Field, Dayton, the world's most advanced fighter, waited in silence beneath the gray American sky. Ground crews stood in heavy coats, their breath turning to mist as a Merlin engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life with a sound that seemed to shake the horizon. The aircraft was the North American P-51 Mustang, already a legend in the making. But today something was different, something unseen, hidden not in its wings or design but in the fuel that filled its tanks. Inside that liquid shimmered the future of aerial warfare, 150-grade aviation fuel, an experimental blend unlike anything that had ever powered flight. As the test pilot, Lieutenant Henry Johnson taxied the fighter onto the runway, engineers and officers watched from the sidelines. They were not expecting a new aircraft to emerge that day. They were expecting a new kind of power. The takeoff roll began. The Mustang's wheels clawed the earth as the Merlin engine screamed through its range, fed by the high-octane fuel that burned hotter, cleaner, and stronger than anything before it. At 25,000 feet, the throttle pushed past its usual limits. Boost pressure climbed, 70, then 75 inches of mercury, a figure that would have torn a normal engine apart. But the Merlin didn't falter. It sang. The airspeed needle surged past every known record for the type, 448 miles per hour, sustained, stable, relentless. Observers below stared at their instruments in disbelief. In that moment, the Mustang was no longer just another fighter. It was a chemical miracle, a machine reborn through science. This was not the creation of new metal or design genius. This was alchemy through chemistry. Until that day, the American Mustang had already been formidable. Its range unmatched, its maneuverability deadly. But against the best of the German Luftwaffe, the Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, the margin of superiority had been narrow. Combat was still decided by pilot skill and circumstance. Now with the arrival of grade 150 fuel, that fragile balance tilted violently in favor of the Allies. The new blend allowed higher manifold pressures, richer fuel mixtures, and thus far greater horsepower without detonation. The catastrophic knock that destroyed engines at high stress. In engineering terms, it was a triumph of chemistry. In strategic terms, it was a weapon of supremacy. To the men at Wright Field, it was clear. This was more than an upgrade. It was a transformation. Back in Europe, the Allied air campaign faced its greatest challenge. American bomber streams were suffering horrific losses. The Luftwaffe's interceptors, fast, agile, deadly, had turned daylight raids into slaughter. What the Allies needed was not just courage, but a technological edge powerful enough to rewrite the rules of the air war. And that edge had just been born on an American runway. From this test forward, aviation fuel would cease to be a passive component of flight. It would become an active instrument of victory. The silent force inside the engine, the unseen power that determined who lived and who fell flaming from the sky. The test ended with a perfect landing. The pilot climbed out, grinning, his flight suit soaked with sweat. "It feels like flying lightning," he said. Words that would echo through Allied command rooms as data poured in confirming the results. That very evening, telegrams were sent across the Atlantic to British Air Ministry liaisons. Tests successful. 150-grade fuel exceeds expectations. Mustang exceeds 440 mph at altitude. Recommend operational trials. The war for air supremacy was no longer about airframes and guns. It had entered a new dimension, the realm of fuel, chemistry, and combustion. The Germans had their aces, their tactics, and their steel. But what they did not have, what they could not imagine, was this new breed of energy, this invisible catalyst that would soon turn the P-51 into a demon over Europe. In the silent hangars of Wright Field, the revolution had begun. And with it, the first spark of victory that would ignite the skies above a burning continent. Long before the P-51 roared over Europe on 150-grade fuel, the real battle had already begun, quietly and visibly, in the laboratories and refineries of two warring worlds. It was a war not of guns and bullets, but of molecules, equations, and boiling points. The outcome of that unseen conflict would decide who ruled the skies. The Germans had entered the Second World War believing they had mastered fuel. Their engineers, masters of precision and innovation, had devised synthetic processes to extract fuel from coal. It was a marvel of chemistry, born out of necessity, for the Reich possessed oil in scarcity but coal in abundance. From this black rock, through the Fischer-Tropsch and Bergius methods, came the lifeblood of the Luftwaffe, aviation fuel designated B4 and C3. Yet these fuels carried hidden limits. B4 offered an octane rating of about 87, C3 barely reached 100. Against the early Allied 87-octane blends, they were formidable. But war, like technology, evolves faster than comfort allows. By 1943, across the Atlantic, the Americans and the British had pushed their refining science into a new realm. The discovery of catalytic cracking, turning heavy crude into lighter, high-performance fractions, unleashed a revolution. Now they could produce 130-grade fuel in massive quantities, and soon after, something extraordinary, a rich mixture performance number of 150. For the Luftwaffe, such numbers were almost mythical. In theory, every 10 points of octane meant the difference between life and death at altitude. Higher octane allowed engines to run at greater compression, with higher boost pressures and richer mixtures, translating directly to more horsepower, faster climb rates, and higher top speeds. To the chemists, it was a simple matter of physics. To the pilots, it was everything. The Allies realized that the war in the air was not going to be won solely by new aircraft designs. It would be won by those who could feed their engines the most powerful fuel. In 1943, this understanding became a doctrine. The United States mobilized its vast oil industry to an extent the world had never seen. Refineries in Texas, New Jersey, and California began producing high-octane aviation fuel in quantities measured not by barrels, but by oceans. British scientists, working in concert with their American counterparts, perfected the formula. The new blend was stabilized by the addition of tetraethyl lead, the same toxic additive that prevented premature detonation, and enriched with aromatic hydrocarbons, toluene, xylene, and benzene, that raised its resistance to heat and pressure. It was dangerous to handle, expensive to refine, and difficult to transport, but it promised an advantage beyond imagination. On paper, the jump from 130 grade to 150 grade did not seem large, a mere 20 points. In reality, it was seismic. Engines running on 150 grade could operate at manifold pressures of 75 inches of mercury or more, levels that would have destroyed engines fueled by anything less. The result was not just improved performance, it was transformation. At Wright Field, the P-51B had demonstrated that increase vividly, its speed leaping from 437 miles per hour to 448 at altitude, its climb rate improving dramatically, its acceleration unmatched. The same aircraft, the same pilot, but a new fuel. It was as if a sleeping beast had been awakened inside the machine. Meanwhile, German engineers tried desperately to close the gap. They experimented with nitrous oxide injection, methanol water mixtures, and other temporary measures to squeeze more power from the Bf-109 and FW-190 engines. These power boosts, known as MW50 and GM1, offered momentary surges of speed but at enormous mechanical cost. Engines overheated, components cracked, and maintenance became a nightmare. Worse, Germany's synthetic fuel production was faltering under relentless Allied bombing. The great hydrogenation plants at Leuna and Pölitz were reduced to ruins by waves of B-17s and Lancasters. Each bomb that fell on those refineries was, in truth, another blow to the Luftwaffe's wings. The Allies had discovered a strategic truth: destroy the enemy's fuel and you destroy his ability to fight. The chemists in white coats were now as vital as the pilots in cockpits. Their discoveries rippled through squadrons and battlefields, turning equations into dominance, laboratory theory into victory. While Germany's fuel reserves dwindled, America's production surged beyond comprehension. Millions of gallons of high-octane fuel stored, shipped, and pumped into the veins of warplanes across Europe. The fuel war, as historians would later call it, was more than a contest of science. It was a test of endurance, industry, and intellect. In the skies above Europe, the results would soon become undeniable. The P-51, once merely a contender, was about to become an apex predator, and when its tanks were filled with 150-grade fuel, it would transform into something the Luftwaffe had never imagined, a demon born not of fire and steel, but of chemistry octane, the invisible number that defined victory. To most pilots, it was a term buried in technical manuals, but to the engineers and scientists of the Allied powers, it was the key to mastering the sky. Octane rating measured a fuel's resistance to detonation, the catastrophic moment when combustion became explosion. A low-octane fuel ignited too early, shattering pistons and melting engines. A high-octane fuel burned smoothly under pressure, allowing engines to operate with greater power and efficiency. In essence, the higher the octane, the more you could push the limits of the machine. During the 1930s, most aviation fuel hovered around 87 octane. a limitation that capped performance and speed. The British learned this lesson the hard way in the early days of the war. In 1940, during the desperate months of the Battle of Britain, Royal Air Force pilots flew on 100-octane fuel secretly supplied by the United States. That seemingly modest jump gave their Spitfires and Hurricanes up to 40 extra miles per hour in speed and a vital edge in climb. It was that advantage, small but decisive, that helped save Britain from defeat in the summer skies. From that point forward, both nations understood. Fuel was as much a weapon as bullets or bombs. As war production intensified, research shifted to creating even more efficient fuels. The Americans, led by visionaries like General James Doolittle, an engineer before he was an airman, recognized that engine design and fuel chemistry had to advance together. Doolittle had been one of the first to earn a doctorate in aeronautical engineering, and years before the war, he argued that the future of air power depended on high-octane fuels. His vision guided an entire generation of scientists and industrialists. In the refineries of Standard Oil, Texaco, and Shell, teams of chemists worked around the clock, experimenting with compounds that could withstand higher temperatures and pressures. The challenge was monumental: to build a fuel stable enough to endure the fury of modern engines, yet volatile enough to deliver the explosive energy of flight. It was chemistry as warfare, a battle of molecules fought in the name of speed. By 1943, they had achieved what had once seemed impossible. The new formula of 130-grade fuel combined the refined balance of hydrocarbons with tetraethyl lead, a compound discovered decades earlier, but now weaponized for aviation. When burned in engines like the Rolls-Royce Merlin or the Pratt & Whitney R2800, this fuel transformed power into supremacy. Yet ambition did not rest. Even as 130-grade became the standard, laboratories pursued something greater, a fuel whose performance would exceed even the concept of octane itself. Chemists began using performance numbers to measure effectiveness beyond the conventional scale. That is how 150 grade came to be, a fuel so stable, so resistant to detonation, that it could handle manifold pressures exceeding 75 inches of mercury. No piston engine had ever endured such forces. The P-51 Mustang, powered by the Packard-built Merlin, was chosen as the ultimate testbed. When engineers combined the aerodynamic elegance of the Mustang with the violent chemistry of 150-grade fuel, the result was beyond imagination. At full boost, the engine produced nearly 1,720 horsepower, over 200 more than before. Every additional ounce of pressure translated into speed, and speed meant survival. For the first time in the war, American fighters could overtake or outclimb almost anything the Luftwaffe fielded. The science of octane had evolved into the science of victory. Behind the front lines, this was the true war of intellect and innovation. Every refinery, every test cell, every clipboard of data was part of a greater battle, a struggle not just for air superiority, but for technological destiny. In the pursuit of perfect power, the chemists had crossed into a realm once reserved for alchemists, turning crude oil into liquid energy of astonishing potency. The creation of 150-grade fuel was a feat of molecular mastery, a precise balance of volatility and stability. To achieve it, engineers blended aromatic hydrocarbons such as toluene and xylene, dense, energy-rich compounds that could survive extreme compression. The secret weapon was tetraethyl lead, the silvery additive that suppressed detonation. Combined with chemical stabilizers and precise distillation, it gave birth to the fuel that would change the world. The Allies dyed it purple to distinguish it from other grades, earning it the nickname purple gas. It was not just a new fuel, it was a new age. When poured into the veins of a Merlin engine, it brought mechanical life to the brink of its design limits. Engines that had once operated safely at 60 inches of mercury could now surge past 75, producing raw, unrestrained horsepower. In test benches and flight trials, technicians watched as pressure gauges trembled and propellers bit the air like blades of thunder. The difference was measurable, undeniable, and astonishing. Aircraft using the new fuel gained speed, climb rate, and acceleration, all critical in combat. A P-51B on 130 grade fuel reached 437 miles per hour. On 150 grade, it surpassed 448. The change was not incremental, it was evolutionary. The same airframe became something entirely new, To German intelligence officers reading reports from the front, the numbers made no sense. Pilots returning from battle described Mustangs that accelerated like lightning and climbed as though pulled by unseen hands. The Luftwaffe command dismissed these accounts as exaggerations until their best pilots began to confirm the same thing. The enemy's fighters were faster, higher, deadlier than before. To counter it, German engineers pushed their Daimler-Benz and BMW engines to the edge. They experimented with emergency power systems, MW50, a methanol water injection that cooled intake temperatures, and GM1, a nitrous oxide system that acted like a chemical supercharger. These systems gave short bursts of speed, but at the cost of reliability. Engines burned out in minutes. The Mustang, by contrast, could maintain its power for hours. While German mechanics rebuilt engines after every flight, American pilots refueled and returned to battle. The difference was not just in machines, it was in chemistry. The 150-grade fuel represented the full industrial might of the Allies. Its production demanded vast resources, specialized refineries, and global coordination. Only nations with immense industrial infrastructure could produce it on such scale. Every drop symbolized America's ability to turn science into strategy. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now being outpaced by chemical innovation. The alchemy of 150 had tipped the balance. By the spring of 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a breaking point. The 8th Air Force was bleeding. Its bomber formations shredded by German fighters. American daylight raids into Germany came at terrible cost. The Mustang had already extended the reach of the Allied bombers, but the Luftwaffe still met them head-on. The introduction of 150-grade fuel changed that equation forever. The first shipments arrived in England under strict secrecy. Only select squadrons were authorized to use it, their aircraft marked and monitored. By May, the tests were complete, and the results were stunning. The Mustangs could now climb faster, intercept at higher altitude, and pursue the enemy with a fury unseen before. When the invasion of Normandy began in June 1944, the skies above France were dominated by these fuel-fed demons. German pilots were caught off guard. They engaged Mustangs that seemed to defy physics, closing distance faster than anticipated, turning tighter, climbing higher. Reports flooded German intelligence offices describing P-51s that exceeded known limits. At first, analysts dismissed them, but soon the pattern was too consistent to ignore. The Allied fighters were now something else entirely. The impact was immediate. Escort missions deep into German territory became routine. Bombers that once suffered horrendous losses now flew under the protection of fighters that could stay with them all the way to the target and back. The Luftwaffe, once the master of interception, now found itself hunted. American pilots, confident in their newfound performance, began sweeping ahead of bomber formations, diving into German airspace to clear the skies before the bombers even arrived. Combat reports from that summer read like chronicles of dominance. Pilots spoke of throttling up and watching Messerschmitts shrink in their mirrors, of climbing above Focke-Wulfs that could no longer follow. The Mustang's reputation soared, its legend sealed not only by design but by the purple fire that burned within its tanks. The Germans tried to counter with improved models, the Bf-109K and Fw-190D, but their efforts came too late. The Allies had not just caught up, they had surpassed. From the beaches of Normandy to the skies over Berlin, the outcome was being written in contrails. The fuel had turned chemistry into conquest. The true measure of 150-grade fuel came not only against enemy fighters, but against a new menace, the V-1 flying bomb. Launched from sites along the French coast, these pilotless missiles screamed toward London at 400 miles per hour, too fast for most fighters to intercept. The task of stopping them fell to the RAF and the USF, and once again the Mustang became the weapon of choice. Fueled by the new blend, P-51s could chase down the V-1s in level flight, intercept them and destroy them before they reached the city. Major R.E. Turner of the 336th Fighter Squadron famously used his wingtip to flip one off course, a maneuver possible only with speed, precision, and nerve. The success of these missions proved that the fuel was not just an experiment, it was a strategic asset. By August 1944, nearly all frontline Mustang units were running on 150-grade fuel. The skies over Europe had changed. German pilots, once confident, now found themselves perpetually on the defensive. No altitude was safe. No dive was fast enough. The Allies had seized the initiative permanently. In the months following D-Day, Allied air dominance became absolute. Bombers struck deep into German territory with near impunity. The Luftwaffe's response grew weaker with every week. Each interception cost them pilots, engines, and precious fuel they could not replace. Allied fighters roamed from the Channel to the Rhine, striking trains, convoys, and airfields. Air superiority became air supremacy. The Mustang, powered by purple fuel, was the embodiment of Allied industry and ingenuity. The Germans fought bravely, but bravery could not overcome science and supply. By the autumn of 1944, even Luftwaffe aces admitted the truth. They were outmatched not just by numbers, but by technology. The sky itself had turned against them. Behind every engine that screamed over Europe stood an army of chemists, engineers, and industrialists who never saw combat, yet decided its course. This was their war, a war fought in laboratories and factories, in the shadows of refineries and under the glow of furnaces. The creation and distribution of 150-grade fuel demanded coordination on a scale unseen in history. American refineries, running day and night, produced millions of gallons each month. British scientists refined formulas to suit varying climates and engine types. Tankers crossed the Atlantic under constant threat of U-boats, delivering the lifeblood of modern warfare. Among the visionaries who made it possible was General James Doolittle, whose foresight decades earlier had driven the pursuit of high-octane fuel. Engineers like Eugene Houdry, who perfected catalytic cracking, transformed crude oil into high-performance fuel that powered entire fleets. It was science serving strategy with precision and purpose. In Germany, the contrast was stark. The Luftwaffe's dependence on synthetic fuel was its greatest weakness. Allied bombing campaigns targeted the very heart of its supply chain, the hydrogenation plants at Leuna, Merseburg, and Blechhammer. Each strike crippled production further. By late 1944, the once mighty German Air Force was rationing fuel by the liter. Pilots were trained in simulators because real flight time had become a luxury. The Allies, by comparison, were drowning in abundance. Fuel flowed from depots to airfields without interruption. The chemists' war had already been won long before the final dogfight. For every bomb dropped on a refinery, for every shipment of purple gas that arrived on English shores, the balance tipped further toward victory. The story of 150-grade fuel was the story of industrial civilization at war, where intellect and invention became as decisive as courage and command. By the late summer of 1944, the transformation was complete. The Mustang, once an underdog, was now the master of the European sky. With its extended range, unmatched speed, and devastating firepower, it escorted bombers from England to Berlin and back again. German fighters that once dictated the terms of battle now found themselves reacting, retreating, and falling. Allied air crews knew the tide had turned when bomber formations returned with minimal losses. The Luftwaffe's once lethal claws had been blunted. Reports from frontline units described near-total dominance, Mustangs chasing Me-109s and FW-190s from the clouds, clearing the skies before the bombers arrived. The psychological effect was immense. American pilots felt invincible. German morale began to crumble. The superiority was not only mechanical, it was symbolic. The Mustang represented the full power of Allied production, engineering, and will. Every sortie it flew on purple fuel was proof that the enemy could no longer compete technologically. From August through December 1944, the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace collapsed. Factories, railways, and refineries burned under relentless attack. Even the jet-powered Me-262, Germany's last hope, arrived too late, and in too few numbers to matter. The Allies owned the sky. Speed, once a measure of survival, had become a symbol of supremacy. By the winter of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages paralyzed entire wings. Aircraft sat grounded, engines silent for lack of fuel. Pilots, hastily trained and inexperienced, were thrown into hopeless battles against overwhelming odds. Allied bombers struck with precision and regularity, escorted by Mustangs that seemed to appear everywhere at once. The P-51s now prowled deep into German airspace, destroying not only aircraft in flight, but also those lined up on runways. With their unmatched range and speed, they became the hunters of the air. The fuel that powered them flowed like rivers from Allied refineries, while the Reich's reserves dwindled to a trickle. Allied bombing raids systematically destroyed Germany's synthetic fuel facilities. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe could no longer train, no longer maneuver, no longer fight. The once feared guardians of the Reich were reduced to scattered, desperate defenses. Hermann Göring himself admitted the inevitable. When I saw P-51s over Berlin, I knew the war was lost. His words captured a truth that every German pilot understood. The battle for the skies had not been lost by courage, but by chemistry. The industrial machine that once powered the Luftwaffe had been outmatched by Allied science. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective force. The skies over Europe belonged entirely to the Allies. May 8, 1945, victory in Europe. The guns fell silent, and the skies, once filled with thunder, grew still. Across airfields from England to France, the P-51 Mustangs rested, machines that had carried the burden of air supremacy on their gleaming wings. Their engines cooled, their tanks still faintly scented with the unmistakable aroma of 150-grade fuel. The war had been won by men and machines, but hidden within that triumph was an invisible hero: chemistry. The fuel that had powered victory was not just a technical achievement, but a symbol of human ingenuity under pressure. It represented the combined genius of thousands: chemists, engineers, laborers, and pilots, working as one in pursuit of freedom. The purple-dyed fuel had given life to legends, transforming aircraft into predators and changing the course of history. In every droplet burned over Europe lay the culmination of science and sacrifice. The story of 150-grade fuel did not end with the war. It marked the beginning of modern aviation, the transition from piston to jet, from the age of metal to the age of energy. The lessons learned in those laboratories and refineries shaped the next century of flight. But for those who lived it, who flew it, the memory remained vivid: the roar of the Merlin, the surge of unstoppable power, the knowledge that in those moments, man and machine had reached the peak of their art. The Allies had conquered not only through strength, but through understanding. It was not merely the wings of the Mustang that carried them to victory, it was the fire that burned within,